Been 31 years working construction sites across the Midwest, and I have the knees to prove it. Bone spurs in both of them. My right shoulder clicks when I raise my arm above my head. I have a scar on my left palm from a circular saw in 1998 that I still explain to people when they shake my hand. None of that ever bothered me, not really. A man builds things with his body, and his body keeps the receipt. What bothered me was coming home to a house that felt like a waiting room. My name is Leonard. I am 63 years old. I live in a small town outside Bozeman, Montana now. And most mornings I sit on the back porch with coffee and watch the light come across the mountains, and I think about how strange it is that a person can lose almost everything and still end up in a place this quiet and this beautiful. I didn't plan any of this. None of it. But I should start at the beginning. I met my ex-wife, Catherine, at a company barbecue in Columbus, Ohio in the summer of 1989. She was wearing a yellow sundress and laughing at something her friend said, and I walked over and introduced myself before I had thought about what I was going to say. I was 28. She was 25. We were married 14 months later in a small church outside our hometown in Indiana. For a long time, we were good together. We built a life. We bought a house in the suburb of Columbus, a 4-bedroom colonial that I put serious sweat equity into over the years. New deck, finished basement, kitchen renovation, 2 bathroom remodels. I did most of the work myself, or with help from guys on my crew. That house was something I was genuinely proud of. Catherine seemed proud of it too, back then. We had 2 kids. Our daughter Ashley came first, and then our son Marcus 3 years later. I coached Little League. I drove to swim meets at 6 in the morning. I read bedtime stories until they were old enough to be embarrassed by it. I was not a perfect father, but I was there, and I was paying attention. What I didn't notice, or maybe chose not to notice, was the slow drift that started somewhere in my early 50s. The construction business had been good to me. I had started my own small company by then, residential and light commercial, and we were doing solid work. But I was gone a lot. Job sites in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, sometimes down in Cincinnati. Catherine had gone back to work part-time at a real estate office, and somewhere in that period she began to change in ways I didn't fully understand until it was too late. She started talking about a man named Stuart. He came up in conversation casually at first. Stuart from her office. Stuart and his wife hosted a dinner party. Stuart knows a good financial advisor. Then Stuart's wife wasn't mentioned anymore, and Stuart started showing up in more of the stories she told about her days. I asked her once, directly, if there was something going on. She looked at me like I had accused her of something absurd and said, "Leonard, he's a colleague. Don't be insecure." I let it go. I am not proud of that, but I let it go. Stuart was a commercial real estate developer, 51 years old, owned a downtown condo and a lake house in Michigan. He wore the kind of clothes that cost more than my guys made in a week, and he talked about investment portfolios the way I talked about load-bearing walls. I met him exactly twice, both times briefly, and both times he looked at me the way certain men look at tradespeople, like I was there to fix something and should get back to it. The conversation I had been avoiding happened on a Tuesday night in November. Catherine sat down at the kitchen table and told me she was unhappy. She said she had been unhappy for a long time. She said she needed more than what we had built together, that she felt like she had been standing still while the world moved on without her. She did not mention Stuart by name that night. She didn't need to. I asked her if she wanted to try counseling. She said she had already thought about it and she didn't think it would help. I asked her what she wanted. She said she wanted a different life. We separated in January. The divorce was finalized in September of that same year. I will not pretend it was clean or painless. It was neither of those things. The house was the hardest part. We had built real equity in it, and the agreement was that Catherine would buy out my share and keep the house. I signed the papers. I handed over something I had built with my hands and my time and a lot of years I will never get back. What I didn't know when I signed those papers was that Stuart had a very different relationship with money than his lifestyle suggested. He spent it, generously and without particular concern for what was coming in. I moved into a rental apartment in a part of Columbus I didn't know very well. 2 bedrooms, ground floor, parking lot view. I went to work every morning and came home every night. And I sat in that apartment and I felt old in a way I hadn't felt before. Not physically old, something deeper than that. Marcus was 22 that year and working his first job at a logistics company in Columbus. Ashley was 25 and living in Chicago. Marcus took the divorce hard in a way that surprised me. Or rather, he took it in a way that hurt me more than I expected. He blamed me. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe Catherine framed things in a way that made it easier for him. Maybe he just needed someone to be the problem, and I was the one who had moved out. But he made it clear in 100 small ways over that first year that he considered me the reason the family had broken apart. Ashley was more measured about it. She was sad, and she told me so, and she called every week for a while. But she was far away, and she had her own life, and gradually the calls spaced out the way they do. Catherine and Stuart got engaged 8 months after the divorce was final. I found out from Marcus, who told me in a tone that suggested he expected me to be upset and was curious to see how I handled it. I told him I hoped she was happy and changed the subject. Stuart was moving into the house I had renovated, room by room, for 15 years. The wedding was in June. Marcus was Stuart's best man. When I heard that, I sat with it for a long time. I am not going to say it didn't affect me. It did. My son standing up at the altar beside the man who was now sleeping in the bedroom I had repainted twice, in the house I had roofed in 2014 in one of the hottest Julys Columbus had seen in a decade. Marcus called to tell me himself, which I gave him some credit for. He said Stuart had asked him, and it felt like the right thing to do, that the family needed to move forward. I asked him as calmly as I could manage, if he understood what he was telling me. He said, "Dad, you have to let go." I didn't have a response to that. I said okay and told him I had to go and hung up the phone. I drove that evening out to a reservoir about 40 minutes from my apartment. I used to fish there when Marcus was young. I sat on the tailgate of my truck and watched the water go flat in the evening light, and I made a decision, not out of anger, though the anger was there, more out of something that felt like clarity. I was not going to spend the rest of my life in that apartment, in that city, surrounded by everything that reminded me of a life that was over. I called my business partner, a man named Dale who I had worked with for 20 years, and we had an honest conversation about the company. Dale was ready to buy me out. We had talked about it vaguely for years, and now it made sense. We worked out the terms over the next few months, fair terms on both sides. I had built something real and I was paid fairly for it. I had been to Montana once, used before for a job that took me to Billings for 3 weeks. I had driven out to the mountains on a free weekend and stood there thinking that this was the kind of place a man could breathe. I had always meant to go back. That was where I decided to go. I found a small property outside Bozeman, an older house on about 4 acres, a detached workshop. Good bones, but needing real work. The kind of project that suited me. I closed on it in March and drove out with a U-Haul in April. I didn't tell anyone except Ashley and a handful of close friends. Marcus knew I was moving, but he didn't ask many details. I let that be what it was. The first year in Montana was the quietest of my adult life. I worked on the house. I got to know the area. I found a hardware store where the guy at the counter knew what he was talking about. I found a diner where the coffee was strong and nobody bothered you if you wanted to sit and read the paper. I started hiking again, something I hadn't done seriously since my 30s. I also made a decision in that first year that turned out to matter more than I expected. I had contacts in construction across the region from years of work, and a former colleague in Denver connected me with a developer who was doing custom residential work in the Bozeman area. The housing market there was moving fast. People coming in from California, from Seattle, from everywhere. They wanted quality builds on land outside town. I started doing project consulting, basically assessing sites and plans and helping developers avoid expensive mistakes. I was good at it, and word traveled the way it does in small industries. By the end of my second year in Montana, I was making more money than I had made running my own crew in Columbus. Not because I was working harder, because I was charging what my knowledge was actually worth, which I had never quite managed to do before. I also met a woman named Carol at a community dinner at a neighbor's place. She was a retired nurse who had moved to Montana from Portland a few years before me. She was smart and funny and said exactly what she meant, which I had come to appreciate more than I can explain. We started having dinner together once a week, and then more than once a week, and then it became something real. I will not go into the details of that, because some things deserve their privacy, but she made the quiet feel less like absence and more like peace. I kept a minimal presence on social media, enough to stay in touch with people I actually liked. Through that, I would occasionally hear things about Columbus, The real estate market there had flattened considerably. Investment properties that had seemed like solid plays a few years earlier were not performing the way people had expected. I noted this without particular feeling. I had no stake in it anymore. Then, in the fall of my third year in Montana, Ashley called me on a Thursday evening. She didn't start with small talk the way she usually did. She said, "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen before you react." I told her I was listening. She told me that Stewart's business had been in serious trouble for over a year. Several commercial development deals had gone badly at the same time. He had borrowed heavily against everything he owned, including the lake house in Michigan and, she paused here, the Columbus house, the house that Catherine had gotten in the divorce settlement and that I had signed over my equity in. Stewart had put it up as collateral, and the loan had defaulted. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings. Catherine and Stewart were being forced out of the house. They had 60 days. I sat with the phone against my ear and listened to the rest of what Ashley told me. She said that Marcus had called her, upset and looking for guidance. She said that Catherine had apparently told Marcus that I might be in a position to help, that I had made money in Montana and could possibly step in somehow. I asked Ashley what specifically they thought I could do. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I think she thought you might buy the house. Keep them from losing it." I set my coffee down on the porch railing. The mountains were doing what they do at dusk out here, turning that particular shade of purple that still gets me even after 3 years. I thought about the deck I had built on that house in the summer of 2003. The kids were young then. We had a party to celebrate and my mother-in-law told me I'd done a beautiful job. I thought about the kitchen tile I had laid on my hands and knees over a long weekend while Catherine was visiting her sister. I thought about the roof. I told Ashley to tell Marcus that I was sorry they were in a hard situation and that I hoped they found a good solution, but that I was not in a position to step in. That I had already given that house everything it was getting from me. Ashley said, "I figured that's what you'd say. I think that's the right call, Dad." There was a silence on the line, and then she said, "I'm proud of you, by the way. I mean that." I didn't say anything for a second. Then I told her I loved her, and we talked for another hour about other things. About 2 weeks after that call, Marcus reached out. A text first, then a call. The call was hard. He was angry in that way he sometimes gets when he's scared, leading with confrontation instead of saying what's underneath it. He said I was being vindictive. He said this was an opportunity for me to show some decency and I was choosing not to. He said that whatever had happened between me and Catherine, they were still his family, and he expected me to care about that. I let him finish. Then I said, "Marcus, I gave your mother fair equity in that house when we divorced. That was her asset to manage. I didn't put those loans on it. I am not responsible for what happened to it. What you're asking me to do isn't decency. It's asking me to pay for someone else's decisions twice." He was quiet. I said, "I love you. That has not changed and will not change, but I am not doing this." He hung up without saying much else. That was a hard few weeks. I won't pretend otherwise. Carol was patient with me when I was poor company. She had a way of being present without pushing, which was exactly what I needed. Some evenings we'd just sit on the porch without talking much, and that was enough. Marcus didn't contact me for about 4 months after that. I sent him a text on his birthday, short and genuine. He responded with a thank you and nothing more. I lived with that. Catherine and Stewart moved into an apartment. I don't know the details beyond that, and I didn't seek them out. Then, on a Sunday morning in late winter, my phone rang and it was Marcus. Not a text, a call. I answered it. He didn't lead with anger this time. He sounded tired and younger somehow than he had in years. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he'd been talking to a therapist, which surprised me, and which I respected him for saying. He said he'd been thinking about the way things had unfolded over the past several years and about some of the things he'd said to me and about the way he behaved around the divorce. He said, "I wasn't fair to you, Dad. I put a lot on you that wasn't yours to carry, and when you didn't do what I wanted with the house, I said things I shouldn't have. I'm sorry for that." I was standing in the kitchen when he called. I had to set down what I was holding. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I told him it had hurt, and I told him I understood that he had been confused and grieving in his own way when the marriage ended. I told him he was still my son and that I had never stopped wanting things to go well for him. We talked for 2 hours that morning. He asked me about Montana, really, I asked. And I told him. He told me about his job, which had changed, and about a woman he'd been seeing for 8 months that I didn't know about. He sounded like himself, the version of himself I recognized from before things got complicated. Before we hung up, he said, "I'd like to come out there sometime, if that's okay." I told him anytime. He came out in May, just him, for 5 days. We worked on a section of the fence line that needed replacing. We hiked twice. We drove out to a spot I'd found about an hour from the house where you can see 3 mountain ranges at once, and we sat there for a long time without needing to fill the silence. He met Carol. She made her pot roast, which is the kind of meal that tends to make people feel at home, and the 3 of us sat at the table until almost midnight just talking. The night before he left, we were sitting on the back porch, and he said, "I didn't think it would look like this out here." I asked what he meant. He said, "I guess I thought you were just getting away from things, running. But this isn't running. This is actually a life." I didn't say anything right away. Then I said, I had to stop trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Once I did that, this is what I found. He flew home the next morning. We talk now, regularly. Not every day, but enough. Real conversations. The kind where you're actually saying what you mean. Ashley came out in August with her husband and their daughter, who is 4 years old and spent 3 days trying to befriend every ground squirrel on the property, watching Ashley walk around the place, seeing her stop at the workshop and look out at the mountains, seeing her relax in a way she doesn't always allow herself. That was one of the better days I've had in recent memory. I turned 63 in October. Carol made a cake. Dale called from Columbus. A few guys from the old crew sent messages. It was a quiet day. Good quiet. The kind that means something rather than just the absence of noise. I think about Stuart sometimes. Not with pleasure, not with anger. More with a kind of neutral recognition that some men build the appearance of success before they've built the foundation for it. That's a construction metaphor, and I can't help those. What happened to him and Catherine is not something I engineered. I did not wish it on them. I just refused to catch them when they fell, which is a different thing. I think about that Tuesday night in November when Catherine sat down at the kitchen table and told me she needed a different life. She wasn't entirely wrong. She did need a different life. It turned out I did too. I just needed longer to see it. The workshop out back is where I spend most of my mornings now. I've been doing furniture, custom pieces, mostly for people in the area who find me through word of mouth. A dining table, a set of bookshelves, a rocking chair that I spent 3 weeks on and that I'm more proud of than almost anything I built in 30 years of commercial work. There is something about making a thing for its own sake. Not on deadline, not for a margin, just because you want to make it as good as it can be. That rocking chair sits on the front porch. Carol has claimed it as hers, which I consider a fair trade. I don't know how much of this story will make sense to anyone who hasn't lived something like it. What I can tell you is that there is a version of your life on the other side of losing the one you thought you had. And it doesn't look like what you'd expect. And it is possible to end up genuinely grateful for the breaking. Not because being broken is good, but because of what you find out you're capable of building when you start from nothing, when no one is watching, when the only person you have to convince is yourself. That is all I have figured out. It took me 63 years and 2 bad knees to get here. I'd say it was worth it. I've been sitting with the story long enough now that I can look at it without flinching. That took a while. There were months where I couldn't think about any of it. Without that specific kind of chest tightness that doesn't come from grief, exactly. It comes from injustice that you decided not to fight, and choosing not to fight something that hurt you requires a different kind of strength than most people talk about. What I've come to understand is this. The choices people make eventually build the life they end up living. Not as punishment, not as reward. Just as consequence, the way a structure either holds or doesn't depending on how it was built. Catherine chose to leave a life that was solid for one that looked more impressive from the outside. Stuart chose to spend money he didn't have on a version of himself he couldn't sustain. Marcus chose for several years to see me as the problem because that was easier than sitting with the complexity of what had actually happened. Every one of those choices had weight, and weight over time lands somewhere. I didn't engineer any of what happened to them. I want to be clear about that. There was no plan. I didn't move to Montana to position myself for some eventual satisfaction. I moved because I needed to stop living inside the wreckage of a life that had already ended. The distance wasn't running. It was the only honest response to a situation that had no solution in the place where it happened. What I gave Marcus in that phone call, the hard one, where he accused me of vindictiveness, was the truth without cruelty. I told him I had already given the house everything it was getting from me. That's not coldness, that's integrity. Integrity means knowing the difference between what you owe someone and what they want from you. Those are not always the same thing, and confusing them is how a person ends up hollowed out. The part I'm most grateful for is what Marcus did with the silence that followed. He could have stayed angry. A lot of people do. Instead, he found a therapist, sat with his own part in things, and called me on a Sunday morning with his voice sounding tired and real. That call cost him something. I know it did. And it built something between us that the easier version, the version where I'd bought the house and smoothed everything over, never could have. Ashley said she was proud of me. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until she said it. Resilience isn't about not breaking. It's about what you build after. I know how to build things. I spent 31 years learning that a structure is only as good as what it sits on, and that fixing bad work by covering it over just means the problem shows up later. Worse, that's as true for a life as it is for a foundation. I'm 63 years old. I have a workshop, a porch, a woman I love, and 2 kids who actually know me now. The rocking chair I built last spring is out front. The mountains are doing what they always do at this hour. I'd say that's a life well built.